Ladies and gentlemen, our program will now begin. Please welcome the CEO of Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so very much. Thought we'd get started a moment early tonight. That way we have more time for the great conversation that awaits us. It's a pleasure to be at the Computer History Museum with all of you tonight for a timely discussion called Data-Driven Insights for Meaningful Climate Solutions. And with us to share their insights and points of view are from Mida Ahmed Bangert from Stanford University, Matthew Gardner from SustainServe and Harvard University, Michael Eibach from the United Nations, and Julie Kay from Click.org. Julie has graciously agreed to lead the conversation in the role of moderator, but because she is a subject matter expert as well, we have asked her to please also weigh in on the conversation. So, Julie, we hope that you will do that. We'd especially like to thank Julie and her colleague, Derek Lyons from Click, as well as Melinda Watts, Jackie Hayes, and Todd Irwin from Zeno Group, and others for their very thoughtful collaboration in preparing for and enabling this occasion for us tonight. Thank you so much. I'm guessing that some of our new guests in the audience might like to hear a few words about the Churchill Club. Next year will be our 35th as an independent, nonprofit thought leadership forum with the mission to strengthen innovation, economic growth, and social good. We do this through approximately 24 programs that we present each year. Some of them are topic-driven, some are format-driven, and some are simply built around particular speakers' points of view. We always ask our speakers not to pitch or promote or position, but always to think of themselves as in a position to advance the discussion versus repeating things that are already out there. And thus, we have a really nice quality of conversations that I think all of us can enjoy. We try to cover what's new, next, not widely known around all kinds of things that are ripe for change, from tech, energy, automotive, healthcare, finance, and much more. And our very first speaker back in 1985 was Bob Noyce of Intel, the then CEO of Intel. A couple more announcements. The hashtag for tonight is Churchill Club, and there is a list of other relevant Twitter codes in your programs. Thanks very much for your attention just now. Let's now welcome Famita, Matthew, Michael, and Julie. Thank you.
Cheers. That's good.
We all could use a sigh after this week, right? Thank you, Karen, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, everyone, for participating in this conversation tonight. We're very thrilled to be here and to kind of kick off this conversation with a little bit of information and background on how we got here, really, and then kind of look to kind of not only the panelists, but also the audience to participate in this conversation, because it's all about finding solutions. And as we all know, some of the news coming out of this week, we have an enormous gap to fill, if you will, when it comes to addressing the issues facing us with regards to climate change. We have the US, obviously, in their position with regards to the Paris Agreement. We have lots of responses to that, of course, that we see all over social media and all over the regular media as well. Then on the other side of the equation, we have the young people, led by Greta Thunberg, doing the climate march, and millions around the world actually looking to adults, to us in the business community, in the academic community, the energy community, industries, and so forth, for solutions so that they can look forward to a sustainable future going ahead. And I think it's up to all of us here in this room to find those solutions, to look not only within kind of our daily lives at home and with our families, but also, most importantly, I think what we're here to converse about tonight is in our work lives. What can we do in our daily work life and in environments, whatever role we have within an organization, to advance solutions towards the climate situation that we're facing? And we have several examples ourselves of what we're doing, and as do the panelists here. But we're really here to talk about those kinds of ideas and share and collaborate even more going forward, because it is going to take every one of us to find the solutions that we need. I was at Climate Week in New York City just a couple of weeks ago, back in September, and attending a meeting on the water kind of situation, if you will. And I thought this was just a wonderful analogy to use and to bring up actually in the meeting tonight. I'm not sure if we have any biology folks in the room or not, but there's a term called imaginal cells. Has anyone heard of the term imaginal cells? It's spelled imaginal, but it's pronounced imaginal. And no worries, I've asked several hundred people whether or not they've heard this term, and they never had actually until I brought it up. Well, this is a term, imaginal cells. Interestingly enough, I think it's fascinating actually. Imaginal cells are the cells that actually lie dormant in a caterpillar, that when the caterpillar dies and spins their cocoon, dies, decays, it's the imaginal cells that have been dormant in the caterpillar that are kind of brought together, if you will, through some unknown catalyst that then turn the caterpillar into the butterfly. It's the actual cells themselves that lie dormant in the caterpillar. And I think kind of it's a nice analogy to use as we kind of look towards solutions. We identify ways in which we could reduce our carbon footprint, find solutions within our organizations, either technologically or with data, to find solutions for the climate crisis. That these solutions are actually just lying dormant. They exist. We just need to actually find the catalysts to bring them forward so we have sustainable movements going forward. So with that, I'd like the panelists actually to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into our kind of questions that we would like to share amongst each other and with the audience here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So I guess I'll start with Michael at the end to introduce himself, and then we'll work through the team here, and then we'll get into our conversation.
Thank you, Julie, and good evening. My name is Michael Leibach, and I work at the United Nations Secretariat based in New York. My role there is Chief of Analytics, but I also fulfill several other roles that are relevant to our talk tonight. I'm a member of an internal board for sustainability of the UN's own operations, in which we develop both policies across the UN, how we make sure that we manage our sustainability better and measure our impact. But also we develop practical solutions that we can talk about later tonight, that provide insights into our operations and what we do, but also act as stimulus for others to join and combine forces within the UN family, but also beyond.
Thanks for being here. My name is Matt Gardner. I'm a managing partner at SustainServe. We're an almost 20-year-old sustainability consultancy based in Boston and Zurich, Switzerland. I met my two partners through our academic work. I was at MIT for a long time, and one was at Harvard, one was in the Swiss university system. And we saw an opportunity back then to work with companies to help them figure out what this thing called sustainability means to their organizations. Back then, we had no idea what we were doing. We started this business and kind of figured it out as we went. You know, things have changed over time, and it's evolved into a really interesting practice, you know, helping companies understand what motivates them, what their data and analytics needs are, which is one of the things we'll be talking about tonight. And then lastly, helping them talk about it. Just a little anecdote, as I was leaving to come here, I've got a 16-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son. And I told him I was coming out here for this event, and then my daughter looks at me and says, "Yeah, but you're flying, right?" So, you know, I think young Greta has made an impact on the world, and, you know, my daughter at least, I mean, she lets nothing slide with her parents regardless. but that in particular caught her attention, and she got me there. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Famida Ahmed Bangert. I am with Stanford University. I'm their Chief Sustainability Officer. My official title is Director of Sustainability Programs. What I focus on with my very, very competent team is looking at, first we start with data actually. We focus on all the assessments and data, see where we are, where we want to be on all aspects of sustainability, energy, water, waste, transportation, culture, living, et cetera. We also focus a lot on education and outreach, so I'd love to rope that in somehow in our conversation since you brought up you're interested in how to live sustainably. And in doing that, we also end up doing, obviously, a lot of infrastructure planning on major solutions. So I'd like to think that I'm part of a campus that has actually looked at solutions for the last 2 decades, and I'd love to share some results with you today. And finally, we look at university as a living lab, what we do at a university level, because we are in touch with so many people and so much enthusiasm. There's actually, hope is sort of, we're in the business of hope. So we take a pragmatic approach with the progress we make, and data is our tool, but primarily we generate hope and solutions for the big challenge that's ahead of us. So looking forward to talking with you all.
Thank you, Famida. And again, I'm Julie Kay of Click.org. Click.org is really the foundation side of a technology company called Click. Click is focused on delivering technology and helping organizations leverage data for decision making. And I have the privilege of managing our foundation side, which encompasses a partnership not only with the likes of the United Nations and C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and other organizations and NGOs, but also most recently with the UN FCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the creators of the Paris Agreement. And the partnership that we formed with them is to actually take their methodologies, which are very complex, very sophisticated, sometimes 90-page long documents, and actually boil them down into metrics that we can build into applications and then deliver to folks that are using these analytical applications to measure their carbon footprint and make better decisions to reduce their CO2 going forward. And we've partnered with a few key customers like IKEA and Volvo in this initial effort, and who are using these kinds of analytical tools now to actually kind of reach their goals. And so, like Famida said, the use of data and kind of taking something, again, very complex and sophisticated, but boiling it down into simple, consumable, usable applications is what we're really focused on doing. And just really excited, obviously, to share that work with you all here today and even learn about what you all are doing and how we might even collaborate on some things going forward. So what we'd like to start with is actually something kind of relatively high level, and that's, maybe it would be interesting to all of you to understand a little bit more about the UN, the SDGs, and how that kind of framework actually exists. We talked to a few folks actually out before we came into the hall here, and thought that would be very useful just to kind of level set, if you will, from Michael's experience and viewpoint, really kind of what the UN is all about with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals and how now this effort towards climate change and sustainable future is kind of stemming from that initial body of work.
Sure, thank you, Julie. So in 2015, the member states of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change met in Paris and agreed on an action plan for individual countries to address the climate crisis. And we have to be aware it is a real crisis, and that's very important for me to convey. Because we are still in a period right now where we're emitting a lot more CO2 than we are absorbing. The level of CO2 emissions is still increasing. We are not at a kind of peak where we manage the problem. So we're having a situation where in our current setup, in our infrastructure, in the way we operate. We produce a lot more greenhouse gases than the planet can absorb. And science tells us if we continue like this, then we soon have a major problem. We're seeing these signs right now. Just to give you a kind of an idea, the kind of benchmark for us to compare is kind of pre-industrial. We're looking at maybe mid-19th century. And between then and now, the world average temperature has risen by about 1.1% degrees. This doesn't sound much, but you see already the effects. You see the ice caps melting, you see sea level rise, you see acidification in the oceans to a large degree. So these effects are taking place right now. The predictions are dire. If we continue at the levels that were agreed at the Paris Convention in 2015, if member states adhere to what they said they would, we would still continue with rising temperatures. By 2100, we would end maybe at about a 3.5 degree increase of temperature from 1.1 that we have today. We also have to understand that the increase of temperature is exponential. In the last 4 years since the Paris Agreement, we have increased global temperature by 0.2%. These are just a few indicators that tell us we have a real problem at hand. Now, the Paris Agreement and its implementation is primarily a political process. And that's very important, even though you can look at it from an angle, well, it's slow, we want action now. And if you listen to Greta and your youth, they come from the other end, they want action now, and they're very right, and we really encourage that. But the political dialogue is key, because if we don't agree on common goals, we will never hit a certain target. But what is also important is these 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were established, we have to understand they are interdependent. We cannot deal with climate change without thinking about eradicating poverty, without thinking about increasing education, increasing access to food security, increasing healthcare. They're all interrelated. So as we commit to these goals, we need to measure how we're actually doing and how one indicator really is supported or sometimes prohibited by another. And this is where it gets tricky. Out of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there were about 230 indicators developed how we measure the achievement of these goals. And I just focus on the environmental ones. So out of the 230, there are about 90 indicators that are relevant to the environment. Today, we know that we probably meet the targets set in the Paris Agreement for about a quarter of these indicators by 2030. We know that we probably don't meet about 10% of these indicators. The real problem is in between. We really don't know how we are doing with the other 2/3 of the indicators. We lack the data that gives us confidence to assess the progress. And that's a real issue. And I think we're looking tonight at discussing this, what examples can we see, what lessons can be learned to really bring that together, that make us understand how we are actually doing and how impactful our actions are. And this is probably where I stop in terms of the broad picture. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so given that, Matt, I mean, you have experience with companies on a regular basis with regards to how they're reporting their metrics to the SDGs. Can you describe some of that work?
Yeah, so me and my team work with global 5,000-ish companies to help them think about sustainability, to help them measure their progress against targets. Over the past years, one of the things that I've noticed, there's two things that have really stuck in the corporate consciousness, and that's the SDGs, companies in general are very aware of, and science-based targets is the other one. Both of those have gained a lot of traction, surprisingly or not, and so I think there's an opportunity there. We can talk about science-based targets and that whole approach maybe down the road in this conversation. The Sustainable Development Goals, it's interesting. I mean, you know, while they have gained a lot of prominence and there's a lot of awareness around them, I think companies still do not understand how to go about measuring their impacts with respect to them. Some companies I see in their, you know, be it their corporate responsibility reports or when they're talking about these things internally, they'll look at the SDGs and they'll say, you know, we like all of them, they're great. But when it comes to what they're actually moving the needle on is another question. A classic example, I was talking to a company in the Boston area recently, and they, with a very straight face, were talking about how they are making progress or they're contributing to SDG 3, the global hunger, alleviating hunger. And I said, okay, tell me more about that. And they said, well, you know, they're serving lunch in their cafeteria to their employees. And they said that with a straight face. There's just this, you know, I mean, I spent a little bit of time then trying to educate them about what they need to be thinking about. But that's an extreme example, but there is, I think, a lack of clarity around, you know, what are the right metrics to be measuring, you know, are there metrics where companies can really be comparing their progress against other companies? Because there's a lot of latitude in the metrics within the SDGs and how individual companies are implementing them. You know, so I think it's just a place for us to continue to work and to evolve the measurement processes, the protocols, so that you really can get good, solid, robust data. So over time, you can see what is really moving the needle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Vamita, I know that you described actually some of the work that's going on at Stanford to become 100% clean energy, which is obviously kind of starting at the SDG level into the individual goal level now to an organization actually making real change. Can you describe how that process worked and kind of went through what you went through at Stanford and the challenges and now kind of where you're at today?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I present a practitioner's point of view, and my specialization is in higher education, having worked in 2 different universities. And to be quite honest, back about 12, 13 years ago, when folks like myself were hired and we were asked to work on this kind of progressive work, we didn't necessarily have the framework of the UN SDGs quite so well defined with so many criteria. And so we kind of made up our own. And I think that happens often in the practitioner's world, because we merge the framework with the realities of how the decision-making actually goes through a big institution and some relatability in the middle. So if we talk about matrix that nobody else is familiar with, that kind of misses the whole opportunity as well as the approval process for big projects. Then again, if we don't adhere to a global framework, then we're also missing the point. So the acting globally or thinking globally, acting locally is very true. For our energy story, we actually had 3 key criteria. We wanted to lead sustainability by example, so we knew that we had to do something clean and renewable. We wanted something that would create a flexible system. So with the different innovations in energy, infrastructure, the industry, we would evolve with time. And then, of course, we wanted to support teaching and research. Now, mind you, I don't know if any of these criteria line up with UN SDG, probably not, but they kind of boil down to, progress, growth, and sort of the core mission. We went through a process very briefly about looking at the current data of where our actual energy usage was. We didn't listen to any particular theory, but rather, what is our real need? And turned out for our campus, there was tremendous overlap between our heating and cooling. And it's, to stay away from technical jargon, there was essentially waste heat that we were not recapturing. And if we could, then we could be thermally self-sufficient and then put the entire platform on an electrified system. And what that lets you is to allow renewables in. So that met our flexibility criteria, that met our long-term criteria. And today we have a heat recovery system that's run with electricity, and the electricity is, well, today 69% renewable, and in 2 years, 100% renewable, mostly from solar. And we went through an approval process with key metrics such as energy intensity, cost savings, carbon reduction, water reduction, carbon per capita, cost per capita, and of course the intangibles like university reputation, what are students learning, et cetera. So I hope that captures, and the process took us about 4 years of decision making with all the data and peer reviews, because it's basically a 50-year project, or a project that would last for 50 years. Implementation took 2.5 years, and the new energy facility came online on 3 days before April Fool's Day in 2015. Have any of you visited our campus to see the central energy facility? Yes. If you are local, every Thursday at 10 a.m., we actually showcase that as a model where greenhouse gases can be reduced effectively with addressing the bottom line and be an educational facility as well. So that's our story, and there's more on our website.
Thank you. And I know that there's actually a data and an AI component to that.
Yeah. So one of the things we had to show during our approval process is how are we going to manage this big, new, somewhat controversial path, because we did away with our cogeneration facility, which has a stronghold in California, and started something that's more district level heat recovery. It's actually, the technology is small, but we applied at a district level and quite popular in Europe. The AI portion was in running the plant. We came up with the model. The former name was Enterprise Optimization Solution, EOS, and Johnson Controls patented it, and now it's a software tool for others to show how all the real-time variables would be managed in order to run this energy system. How much electricity to get from the grid, to what level should the chillers be run, how much heat to store, how much to repurpose to campus real-time. There are about 1,200 variables, to be specific, and that's hard for a person to decide. So AI, back then we didn't quite call it machine learning. Now that's the term that's quite popular. We didn't call it artificial intelligence either, but turns out that's what we did. But it greatly supplemented the decision making for our leadership, because it gave them confidence, and it allowed them to imagine a future that would last at least 50 years or beyond.
If I can just add to that, Julie, I mean, I think Fahmita's story here just really highlights the opportunity that we have, and I think it's one of the reasons that this conversation happening here in the Bay Area is so important, because of the horsepower that this part of the world represents. There's so much of a data and analytics-driven component to this. I mean, in order for us to design good climate solutions, we have to know where we stand now, and then to set smart targets for where we want to go in the future. And there's all philosophies around setting goals that we can get into. But the bottom line, though, is that we've got to have good data, and we have to understand what each of our collective impacts are in order for us to then know where we need to get. In the corporate greenhouse gas accounting world, there's different scopes, so-called scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, types of greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 just comes from the fuels that you burn, basically. Scope 2 emissions come from the generation of energy off-site that you then use on-site, so electricity generation is the classic example. Those two, I mean, it's not easy in all cases, but it's totally doable, and it's just basic physics and chemistry calculations, more or less. If you know how much if you know how much fuel you're burning, you can convert that into CO2 and figure that out. Where it gets hard is in what's called scope 3 emissions, because as a company, the vast majority of the impacts that you have in most cases are coming from your supply chain. So all of the energy and emissions that went into producing the raw materials that you're using on site, that's where your impacts are greatest. But those are also really hard calculations to do. Yeah. And there is literally PhD dissertations being written about this stuff. I mean, there is a protocol for doing it, but when you actually implement it, it's hard. And the error bars are quite large there. So if we're going to really make progress in this, I think someone maybe sitting in this room or at one of your companies really spending some time to figure out good, empirical, accurate, reproducible ways of calculating value chain impacts would be really important.
Second that, third it, because all the work we did it based on scope 1 and 2 because that's what we could measure. Right. For scope 3, we don't even have proper protocols. However, that's probably where the poetry is, because once we figure out the scope 3, that's how I think we will link back to UN SDGs most effectively, because a lot of the qualitative metrics will come out. So the work is actually, I believe, amongst the three of us. We have to interpret, we have the data for scope 1 and 2 and do a lot of the energy projects and others based on that. But the social good, the connectedness of the variables, understanding the supply chain, understanding how a company's work actually relates to what's happening globally. Once we quantify it, tie it to the solutions, I believe we will all be able to report to the UN SDGs much more effectively. Mm-hmm. And that's where the work is.
Yeah. So with regards to scope 3, I know, Michael, we've worked on a project to kind of begin calculating some of that. Do you want to describe that project that's ongoing at the UN today?
Yes, we have to start somewhere. And
right.
When we looked into our own operations, one of the key contributors to our carbon footprint is air travel. The nature of our work requires that we travel a lot, so it's not that we can kind of completely abandon air travel. But while everybody in the UN is aware of this, we lacked, and we are still lacking, hardcore data that allow us really to drive decisions around air travel. So what we did is we developed an application where we started simply tying the carbon emissions to a flight. And we have about 100,000 flights a year that we manage in the UN. And that in itself creates a much more specific picture. Before we reported at an aggregate level, now we can break it down. So I can look how much carbon I contribute in my capacity at work. And but what was also key was that we wanted to develop this in a decision-making tool. So instead of just stopping with a kind of historic perspective, how much have we traveled and how big is our carbon footprint? We wanted to influence people as they decide to travel, as they plan travel, in giving them the option to look into how much carbon will I produce if I choose a particular route vis-a-vis another, or what is important to us is also the amount of meetings that we have. While we try to cut down, we inevitably have a lot of meetings to take place, and the UN's function is to a significant portion also determined by hosting global meetings. We are hosting about 2,000 meetings as UN every year. So imagine the kind of impact we can create if we kind of show people the carbon-related consequences of these meetings. So what we did with this application is we had two parts. One is really on the data preparation side, and it has been a manual process in the past, and our collaborators, Click was included, we came up with a solution that allows us to automate this process, which I think eliminates about at least 6 months per year of work. So we have clean data, absolutely key. And then the second part is really to visualize these data and provide some scenarios. So we can look at the carbon emissions based on flights. We have a trip planner. If I plan my trip, we can now factor in the carbon footprint to this, and this will have a decision-making impact. And thirdly, we have a meeting planner where I can key in all the data of the participants that we have, and then the platform will kind of propose the optimal meeting location that we have. And that's a small example, but for us, it is a practical tool, and it sends the right data to decision makers to take this further.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I think, it is a small part of it, but there's some critically important stuff in what you're doing. The whole decision-making support piece of it, I think, is crucial. If you think about environmental impacts or greenhouse gas impacts that companies have, in most cases, they are backwards looking. They are the impacts that you had last year. But to be able to model or to support decision-making moving forward is critically important so that you can do a trade-off analysis, you can do a scenario analysis. What happens if we do this or that? That's a capability that is really underutilized, I think, in the whole sustainability conversation and the climate conversation. And so again, the assignment back to all of you folks here, or for that next startup company, is to really think about, how can you do forward-looking modeling? And it's not just climate, but it's also all of the SDGs in terms of the impacts that you're having on the world. What can you be, looking at moving forward, some decision support, so that as you're becoming the next CEO of whatever company, you can be using support like that to make the best decisions for the company and also the world.
And likewise, I think with regards to kind of these replicatable solutions, if you will, one, the travel analysis kind of example that you described, Michael, that could be a module that every company could use. In fact, one of the consulting organizations that supported that development, actually then their CEO learned of that application and said that they were going to implement that for their own kind of travel analysis, if you will. So there's a lot of these kinds of nuggets, if you will, that can be developed as a best practice and then shared amongst all companies, again, so we're not all recreating the same wheel, but that we can begin to measure these different components of our carbon footprint with better analytics, again, and the decision-making part of that as well. And then I know there are quite a few technology folks here in the room, makes sense, right, based on the location. But, we kind of had this idea at Click to create these kinds of applications, but we sit at the business intelligence layer, right, the analytics layer. If you think about it, back into kind of the underlying systems like the ERP systems and even the invoicing systems and those types of systems, what could be changed in those technologies so that the data is collected at the ground level so that the analytics is just, is easy, quite honestly. And I think about kind of like ways in which, as a company, our carbon footprint is mostly comprised of electricity bills from our offices. We have about 60 offices around the world. We receive invoices, electricity bills at those offices, locations. They're sent actually to an outsourced agency that scans those invoices and sends the data to pay that bill or invoice directly into our ERP system, into our financial system. Well, that scanning system, interestingly enough, is able to pick up a dollar amount of what the invoice needs to be paid because that ends up in our ERP and then the check goes out, right? Just as easily, that scanning could be designed to pick up the consumption figure, the GHG kind of consumption figure, and that amount could actually also go into our ERP system so that at the end of the year when I'm going to calculate our carbon footprint, pulling up a report of all of that consumption data is actually just, readily available. And that's a minor tweak to an ERP system and a scanning kind of process, if you will, to begin collecting that data so that the analytics, and instead of spending all of our time as a small company just kind of capturing data and trying to read PDF documents and invoices, we could be spending our time making decisions. Should we have that much real estate in that location? How can we reduce our electricity usage in that location and so forth? We could be thinking about the programs to impact the reduction versus just spending all of our time reducing or collecting data. And I think for the technology kind of sector representatives in the room, we can all have these ideas about what can we change within our technology to actually make that data collection and capture much easier so that, again, the data can be used and time can be spent using and performing analytics on that data versus just simply trying to create it and capture it.
In the case of Click, it's a number of offices where there's an electricity bill, which is accessible, and you can then do the totals and all of that. I have a client in Europe who's a big global logistics company, where they're basically just a head office. and they don't own any ships or any trucks or any planes, and they, so they outsource all of that. So the data challenge for a company like that, which is true for many organizations, is that they have to go and ask this small little mom and pop trucking company in Romania how many gallons of diesel fuel they use to ship their stuff from Brussels to wherever. So the data challenges across organizations, in some cases they can be simple, in some cases they can get wildly complicated. And again, I think that's part of the IT opportunity that's out there, is to tighten that up, and to fill in those gaps. Because without that data, we don't know where we stand, we don't know what our baseline emissions are. So in order to set science-based or non-science-based or any targets at all, it's really hard to do it then.
Yeah. Michael, we kind of have this kind of funny antidote story in common, which I'd like to share with the group here, because I think it kind of resonates or kind of picks up on this topic if everyone really can play a role. And that's in we hosted a meeting of amongst about 30 folks from across the UN Environment, the Sustainability Committee, and that to kind of walk through these dashboards that Michael described, the data prep dashboard that was cleaning the data, the travel records that were coming into this application system, and then the visualization kind of side of that to analyze the data. And we had this conversation for about 10 minutes amongst people in the room about this one particular field that was just kind of causing everybody a lot of headaches, right? This field that existed in the ERP system that actually, was a free-form field, and anybody could enter any piece of data or any information into that field that they wanted. But to the Sustainability Committee calculating the carbon footprint, that was a really important piece of information. They were using that field, but spending hours trying to clean up the data that came through the system for them. And lo and behold, the programmer actually responsible for that field, maintaining that field in the ERP environment, was actually in the meeting. He was in the room. And he hadn't really even, I think, connected his work actually in developing kind of the platform, if you will, to this big concept of fighting climate change. But when he heard this conversation, he thought of an idea of how he could tweak this field to not make it free-form, make it a kind of a selection list, if you will, thus saving hours of time to clean up this data, making this data kind of much more easy to analyze and flow through the system, because it was just one of these fields that the carbon calculation needed to work properly. And it was going to be somewhat of a small change, a minor change for that individual programmer. And I was really inspired by that because, we talk about this big scary topic of climate change, and we see all of this scary kind of news stories and, obviously goals and all of that have to be reached. But in a very short meeting, we were able to take that scary topic and boil it down to that one individual programmer's ability to affect change. He now relates his job and his role to this concept of fighting climate change. And just on kind of his, pride, for lack of a better word, in kind of playing a role in the solution, that was just a very kind of invaluable and exciting moment. And I think that's, as I kind of talked about this imaginal cell concept, I think we all have these opportunities within our day jobs to find what is unique about what we do that could actually kind of aid, if you will. It might seem small, it might seem simple, but at the end of the day, it could add to the solution of a very complex problem.
If I might just add to that, Julie, it triggers this thought in me about what makes us better at managing our sustainability as organizations. And part of it is really the inclusiveness. There is a tremendous amount of interest and goodwill among our staff. And we don't harness this enough. It's very simple. So I think the more we communicate, the better. But it goes also beyond this. And we, as the United Nations, we benefit a lot from partnerships in multiple forms. And the problems that we are discussing, they are too big for an individual organization, too big for an individual country. And I think if we pool together our collective experience and learn from each other, then I think we can accelerate the path towards really sustainable solutions. And that's really, really a passion that we have in the United Nations. We are open to engage at multiple levels. I mentioned we need more data, but we need more data infrastructure to manage. We need more algorithms, and they exist somewhere already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you mentioned this earlier, Matt, as well. And it's, when I talk about we also have to be aware that this is a global issue, and we have a disparity of capacity and capability in the world. But the solutions exist in small pockets, and if we make them become more visible and transparent, I think we can accelerate that journey significantly.
I'd like to work that thread a little bit. Time is of essence. It really is. I started to tell my students, like 10 years. We've got good 10 years, not to really reverse anything, but at least pause some of the worst effects. And you see this in studies, media has picked up more and more. So how are we going to do 50 years of work in 10 years? Data has to come in, automation has to come in, we have to leapfrog a lot so that we don't find ourselves from an age of mitigation to all of a sudden adaptation, which is starting to happen. In many ways, we are already in adaptation mode. So data is really, really important because we have to accelerate and we have to position it. So if the tools like that you talk about, I had a career in software prior to sustainability, and I actually gave that up because it no longer aligned with my moral code in wanting to do something about the environmental degradation. And 15 years later, I still look at software and I feel that where is that all-encompassing ERP or CRM solution that can allow a company like myself or yours to just know where the data is, see the trends, see the projections, and figure out, this doesn't quite align with our long-term existence, so let's tweak this. So I absolutely agree that everything is there, but somehow it's not together, and I believe that actually speaks to leadership. How to combine aggregate the leadership tools together so everyone agrees and march towards the same goal, that is the ultimate mystery. Perhaps data would be the way to do it because it's a common language and it's apolitical in many ways, and it's perfect for United Nations to use that language. But perhaps that's the same language for all of us as well, because the missing link in all this is actually collective leadership. And that's why the Gretas of the world are so angry today. They really shouldn't have to be, but they are. But those of us who've also observed it for at least a few decades now, we know that our pace of action has been slow. So I passionately agree with what you're saying, and I hope in the next few years we can connect a lot of the dots in a hurry to make some real progress that we can be very, very proud of looking back, and hopefully not too distant future.
It's interesting because some organizations are really good at this kind of innovation. I think, again, this environment that we're in here tonight, I think academia has a tremendous role to play. I mean, academia, it can be, some of the most conservative, silo-driven thinking in the world. Decentralized. There's all kinds of, I think, adjectives we could use to describe it. But at the same time, the intellectual horsepower of the students, I mean, you go onto Stanford's campus or MIT's campus at 10, 11, 12 at night, and just the energy that's there and the creativity, figuring out how to harness that and really move that, and to encourage that and stimulate this kind of thinking, I think represents a tremendous opportunity. Julie, if I can ask you a question. I mean, we're talking about corporations and academia and all of that, but I'd love, would you mind just saying a few words about your work with C40? Because I think municipalities, cities have a huge role to play in this kind of thinking as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So our partnership with C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, for those of you that don't know, is an organization based out of New York City. They also have a pretty large office in London. And really what their goal is to convene the 94 megacities of the world around kind of common policy changes and movements and work towards fighting climate change within the cities. And it was led for a few years by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, and was most recently actually moved, the chairperson became Eric Garcetti of LA, who's now the current chairperson as of October. So C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group is all about these cities coming together and sharing ideas with regards to the data that they're collecting in their cities and the work that's being done. And it can, includes the work such as, green electric buses to bike paths to, energy efficiency in buildings within the various kind of city governments. So one example of kind of the work that we've done with C40 is a project that we did with the city of Boston. So the city of Boston, this is a data problem. We tend to always look at the data and the data problems and focus on those for solutions. But the city of Boston has an ordinance where every building over a certain square footage has to report their carbon emissions actually to the city of Boston for 3 years, and then after 3 years submit a climate action plan of how they're going to actually reduce their carbon emissions. And all of this data is self-reported by the property owners, and it's all just collected in spreadsheets. So the sustainability department in the city of Boston had these series of spreadsheets that they were trying to go through, clean up the data, understand what buildings, what property owners were in compliance, where were their biggest opportunities for change, and how could they even use this data to measure their progress to their goals of carbon neutrality by 2030. And so in taking this data, kind of a real-world solution, if you will, we took this data, we put it into an analytical tool, and this dashboard's now being used by the City of Boston, the Sustainability Committee, to just even quite simply identify the property owners that are out of compliance, that are in compliance, and which ones they can work with actually on these climate action plans towards progress. Kind of goes back to the old adage that Michael Bloomberg stated, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So again, what might have seemed kind of like a very complex situation, a very complex problem, we boiled it down to a simple solution. Let's just get better access to this data so that people can start, again, acting upon the information that's in front of them versus spending all of their time just kind of trying to figure out where the errors lied and how to clean up the data and even how to collect it.
Do you have data on that data? Like how many people are actually using that information to make better decisions?
We do actually. I had the privilege of talking to Mayor Walsh in Copenhagen at the Global Mayor Summit. Yeah. And no, they are using it, and they're identifying properties that then need to be kind of handheld, for lack of a better term, through the process of reporting. Yeah. As well as those properties owners who are anxious to do something, change to renewables, like you did at Stanford, and may need a fast track through the permitting system, for example, which is an entirely different city department, right? Which are very different silos in and amongst themselves. But yeah, so we are kind of working with them to understand how this data can be used not only by the city officials, but also even released to the public, so the public can become aware of the property that they reside in and how energy efficient is and how that property owner is responding.
I ask because this has workforce implications. As you become more and more sophisticated and use data as the driving tool, the workforce that generates the data uses the data and actually creates the meta decision making. They may not be the same type of people that originally thought about it. So talking about data in isolation of workforce, or I position it differently, talking about data is more useful if we talk about it in terms of what it's doing to the workforce and actual actions taken, which is why in our campus we have hundreds of dashboards, but we have no idea who looks at them, and then our leadership sometimes challenges us saying, all those dollars spent on fancy software, who is using the data to make those critical decisions? Mm-hmm. Are we still actually, at the end of the day, synthesizing all of it to the key decision makers so things are budgeted, funded, implemented, and done? So I'm just kind of curious if that loop closed. because it's fascinating to produce dashboards that are attractive, informative. The long-term implications of that comes down to people and processes and information sharing. So if you know more, I'm genuinely just curious because it sounds like such a good success story. We haven't been as successful with our dashboards.
Yeah, and there's a long way to go yet.
Yeah.
We are just getting started, but that's another kind of philosophy that we've taken, which is we need to at least take that first step before we can, kind of take further steps. So, yeah.
If I might just add a few short comments.
We're having conversations.
I know.
Yes.
We're our own
So
Q&A.
we are about to launch a data strategy. And we were in the same situation. We built all these fantastic dashboards, and then actually we track the usage.
Okay, good.
And it's not that great, to be quite honest. And we identified the issue is with data literacy. Well, decision makers demand good data and access to better data. They really don't know how to deal with it when they have it.
Yeah.
So we make data literacy a significant part of our data strategy, and I think we will close this gap.
Yeah. Thank you.
It also speaks to the need or the value of providing context around the data that we're using. Yeah. There's a movement in the whole sustainable investing world towards what's called the SASB, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board framework, which is a very data-driven set of frameworks where investors can just look at what company X's carbon footprint was, and then make investment decisions based upon this suite of data. And I've always kind of looked askance at that because it removes a lot of the context behind the data, and I think that that's a critical part of the overall story. It's not just a snapshot in time, but it's a trajectory over time. It's, what are the aspirations of the company? What is the kind of the geographical, geopolitical context within which the organization operates? All of that is crucial information that we need to be considering. When we're making climate-related decisions or setting science-based targets or whatever, we need to be thinking about workforce implications. We need to be thinking about, what do we need our students to be trained in moving forward? All of this stuff has to be considered. And so, despite being, one of 4 data nerds up here, I really think that we have to be thinking about these other dimensions to this question as well.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think, I know myself, I can talk for hours, and I think, but we want to open up the conversation, obviously, to the audience for Q&A. Obviously, we've kind of touched on a lot of different areas here. And so now we'd love to take questions. Definitely want to focus on solutions, right? But there's a couple of folks walking around with microphones, so we'll have a good amount of time here for Q&A.
So I have a question. We didn't talk about the oil companies here. And to be honest with you, I feel like they're the root of all evil. I was raised in New York City as a child. I knew that oil was bad, gas cars were bad. I've always wanted a smaller car. But, a lot of barriers to entry for a lot of these electric cars or solar panels in America are, I think, because of these, and not only that, but we have a lot of data, but our president is in denial. These guys buy politicians left and right. How do we fight that, even with good data?
I'll bite.
That's a big one.
That's a big one.
Without getting too political about it, I think that one of the steps that we can take as a society, as an economy, as a society, would be to introduce true, full life cycle cost accounting into pricing. Where you're really you're internalizing a lot of external stuff that hasn't been accounted for up to now. I think that just that alone, and really to drive true pricing out there in the economy, so that people can make a decision then based upon what those costs are, and that would include environmental costs, social costs, things that are hard to calculate, and you need lots of data to do it. But I think that would be a big step forward in leveling out the playing field in terms of a lot of the choices or a lot of the, the options that we have out there. That's just my my 2 cents.
And that's how renewables lost the game to natural gas, right? The reason why renewables became so cost competitive in California and so many users adopted it is because at the end of the day, companies made also practical decisions, not just moral or environmentally inclined ones, is because renewables became very cost competitive. So at the end of the day, it's still data. It may not be presented in the way you had originally hoped or aspired, but at the end of the day, it's still presenting the kind of information that's convincing. And I think we've all experienced that in our lives and in our work. It doesn't always have to be the president of a company or a bigger scale. In our own lives, we sometimes position and reposition in order to convince children, adults, community, neighbors, and the tenacity to keep using data as a neutral argument, I think that's really, really important.
Amen.
If I might just add a final thought, I think it's also useful to look at the fact that going into renewables or alternative energy sources is not necessarily a bad business decision. For example, there is a global ranking, I think by Corporate Knights, that ranks the 100 most sustainable organizations every year. And I was surprised that in 2019, the number 3 was a petroleum refinery company. I thought, how come? How do they make it up there? And this company, until very recently, did their mainstream kind of oil refinery work, and they switched to biofuels. So today, a quarter of their revenue is generated from biofuels, which accounts to 50% of their profit. So we have viable business models that teach us that there are options in the alternative energy market that are very attractive.
If you can become the chief sustainability officer to the company that you actually disagree with the most, that's a life choice. Because you can change it from within.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. Oh, another question?
Yes, hello, Steve Gans with Teamify. I noticed that the discussion has been very much micro-oriented. How can we adhere to particular measures in our own actions? I'm kind of curious at a slightly broader level. What are the biggest questions we'd like the data to answer for us about, well, for example, and really just a for example, say methane emissions versus CO2 emissions on, say, climate rise versus sea level rise versus climate instability. So what are the questions you'd like to most to have answered in order to adjust the more micro measures?
Yeah. I can start that a little bit. We recently did long-range planning at our university, and I was part of the faculty-led design team, and it was actually exactly that question. Predicting the future is now really important at a high resolution. So we know the basics of the carbon, and we know the basics of the impact, but what we don't know is at what rate, what elements of nature, or what elements of the way weather patterns work, how would that manifest? So being able to predict that has actually become the meta question that would drive a lot of the innovation, I believe, in the next 10 years or so. Because that's one of the ways human cultures would be able to at least mitigate or adapt to the changes that have already been set in motion, but now we actually have to understand it. And at a very practical level, utilities, infrastructure, buildings, bridges, everything, all our physical existence actually depends on it. So very high resolution reality data and at what rate is very important to be able to see.
I think from my side, there's two things I'd love to see. One would be empirically rigorous, really understanding carrying capacity, across different ecological systems. So, what is, we have this so-called carbon budget out there for science-based targets. I'd like to know what is the carrying capacity for many of these other ecological processes that we have that support life on this planet. Related to that, is, and I keep telling my team I'm going to do this someday, and I think they would all quit, but spend some time building an Uber model, not Uber the company, but kind of a meta model, whatever the term is, that connects a lot of the different kind of latest, greatest state-of-the-art thinking around climate versus human health modeling versus global transport models versus fish populations in the ocean, whatever. Get these things talking to each other. And it could be ultimately a decision support tool. I think there'll be a lot of PhD dissertations written about this along the way. But I think if we could get to a point where we could start to really understand this grand system dynamics equation that drives our planet, then we could start to make smart decisions, or at least more informed decisions.
And just to echo what Matt said, I think what we need is a planet dashboard.
Yeah.
That allows us really to.
Amen.
I'll get on that one. Next question.
Hi, my name is Judith Schwartz. I'm from a company called To The Point, and I'm a former commissioner on the Palo Alto Utility Advisory Commission. And one of the things I didn't hear you talk about at all is the idea of the timing of when the electricity is produced. So according to the ISO data, CalISO data, the lights that are on right now are coming from natural gas plants primarily, about 80%, either from within California or imports. And when we can put all the solar, we could triple, quadruple the solar on the system right now, but it wouldn't affect that when what's causing the lights to go on. And I think one of the interesting things that has come out of the work at Stanford in the Precourt Institute has to do with true carbon accounting and transparent carbon accounting. And so could you talk a little bit about how in your respective organizations you're talking about coincident demand and supply, because it matters when the electricity is produced and when it is consumed, and annualized accounting doesn't really help us solve this problem, but solutions like hybrid solutions that bring storage and gas generation together can reduce decarbonization now and can answer Greta's concerns that the adults take action immediately.
So I think there's probably 1,000 different rabbit holes that we could dive down in this conversation. I think, and that's a really important one. I know just enough to be dangerous in this topic, but I think that what you're talking about though is this whole concept of integrating demand management, energy storage, just all of these different aspects that we have available to us to help utilities run more efficiently. It depends. I would think that it depends on the market where that you're talking about. What is that base load capacity that you have and the technology that you have to generate that? Do you have storage available nearby? So there's many different angles. So there's no simple answer to it. Managing our utilities more efficiently, upgrading the grid so that we're moving energy from point A to point B more efficiently without the transmission losses that are associated with that and the consequent greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted. All of this needs to be addressed as part of this. I think that for us to be thinking as a society around greenhouse gas targets, if we don't take into account our energy generation infrastructure, we're missing the boat, or at least a significant chunk of it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have anything for Kim? Next question.
Yes. I think, even though I think this is a very good discussion here, but I cannot help feel a little bit disattached a lot of times. A lot of discussion and seems to be ad hoc, but nationwide, what is the goal? Suppose we only have a 10-year window. Over these 10 years, do we have a unified gauge or a measurement, standardized measurement? Each year, we're going to improve a little bit toward a certain goal. And after 10 years, if everybody or every citizen of the globe trying to achieve that specific goal set for that specific year, And then after 10 years, we are going to meet the standard. My guess is that we need to have a unified measure or standardized measure for a specific unit, for a country, or for the whole globe, where this measurement we can use a lot of data to measure, and then we set a standard based on this measurement, and that's a target. We can gradually measure whether or not we perform well against that standard measure, or if not, what is the gap and how much we need to catch up next year, so we will be able to not only finish next year's target, but somewhat make up for what we have missed this year. So I think standardization of the measurement a lot of times might be an important thing. A lot of academic research or industry probably should spend time on or focus on. I just want the panelists to make comments on this.
So I think, so what you're describing, I believe, if I understand your question correctly, I mean, you're talking about the concept of science-based targets. Where basically the global science community has come up with a greenhouse gas budget for the planet that basically says we need to stay under that budget in order for, and if we stay under that budget, then we may avoid some of the more dramatic implications of climate change. So the budget was initially set at a 2-degree rise. It's now set at about a 1.5-degree rise. And we're already, skating right up to that, and we'll probably surpass that. But the idea, though, is that there is a number of metric tons of greenhouse gases, or CO2 equivalents, that we can emit and slowly reduce on, and that will impact the whole climate change issue. So that, from a physics perspective, that's a relatively straightforward concept. It's more of a policy, political will issue. Can we get organizations, companies, countries working together to achieve that? That's a much harder question. I mean, when you have the U.S., yesterday or whatever, finishing pulling out of the Paris Accord or whatever that means. We know the science. The science isn't in doubt, plus or minus a couple of percent. It's really a question of, from a policy perspective and an implementation perspective, how do we get there? And that's true for big companies, small companies, really whatever. I mean, I would actually challenge us to be thinking in different ways about this. It's not just a goal. I mean, and I was telling Julie this earlier, but in my work, what we've kind of see is that there's been kind of 4 steps to the whole goal setting process that companies are making around climate change. So the first, goal number 1, or the first step, was for companies just to measure and their impact, their own inventory. Step number 2 is to set a reduction goal, right? Step number 3 are these things called science-based targets, where you're actually setting a goal within the context of a planetary budget for carbon dioxide or for CO2 equivalents. The 4th step that some companies are starting to take, where I think we just need to shift to en masse now, is to be thinking about some kind of restorative goal that says, instead of saying how much can we continue to damage the Earth, you're basically saying how much are we going to fix it? Yep. And take CO2 out of the atmosphere over the course of us doing our business and generating value for our shareholders and for our stakeholders. Okay, we need to move to that direction, where that needs to be the corporate mindset. Instead of saying, I want to damage less, I want to do more good.
And that's the circular economy thinking. That's actually the circular economy thinking that's starting to come into the psyche of businesses and others. Is we are in a linear economy, take, make, waste, and circular economy eliminates waste and makes sure that materials stay in the economy as long as possible, and in the process replenish the environment. So if what you just said could be done and have a political standard or a nationwide target that everybody was following, then that would be utopia. Yes.
Yeah. And there's kind of an interesting example that I'd like to share with kind of that happening today. So Bill McDonough, one of the kind of founders or forefathers, if you will, of the circular economy and a book, Cradle to Cradle, has an organization called greenblue.org. It's based out of Charlottesburg, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is housed. And there's this wonderful little think tank with regards to sustainable packaging, and they have other kind of areas of interest as well. A project that we're working on with them is in this sustainable packaging kind of area, where they have data collected from the US Forest Service. We have very good data, actually, on the extraction of trees, the replantings of trees, and the mortality, right? Simple math equation of whether or not this forest is sustainable or not. So they're layering that data of all 50 states, actually, with a data set that describes the mills that exist in the United States, understanding that they actually get their wood from a 50-mile radius around their site. And so that's another layer of data. And then a third layer of data that greenblue.org is measuring and helping the private sector with is where are companies purchasing their products from what mills, right? Where are companies like Georgia Pacific purchasing their products from, Staples, you name it. And so they can actually, they have a project ongoing with these 3 layers of data that can go back to an organization like Georgia Pacific and say, when you buy from these mills, you're buying sustainable forestry products, but when you're buying from these mills, you're not. And thus, they can use their influence to actually, have positive change, to inspire those particular landowners or forest owners, some of which are private, some of them are national, to actually start practicing sustainable practices. So we're getting there, and again, it's a very complex problem, and lots of different solutions can be applied, but there are ways in which data and tech and just kind of people getting together and collaborating with these ideas can make a difference, can make an impact. Next question.
I'm Mariana Grossman, and I want to get back to the question of why data gets ignored. And I think that if you think about financial data, companies pay a lot of attention to it. They have departments that focus on it, and software, and consultants, and tax accountants, and there's the IRS, and the SEC, and there's shareholders. So people really care about the financial performance of companies or cities or other entities. We don't have the same kind of accountability for carbon budgets. And I think we need to have 2 kinds of carbon budget. We need a emissions reduction budget and a carbon drawdown and sequestration budget. I think there's 1 trillion gigatons of carbon that we need to draw down to get to 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I think saying that we're going to keep going up is suicidal and planetary. It's a planetary ending, or at least civilization ending. And we can abandon the planet to cockroaches and bacteria, but probably our kids and grandkids wouldn't like that, and maybe we wouldn't either. So I would like to see a commitment to carbon budgeting that's as serious as financial budgeting. And otherwise, it's like nice. So yes, you flew, but did you offset that carbon by either buying offsets or planting trees or doing something? Do you have a carbon budget that you're managing as rigorously as you would manage your checkbook or your company or organization's financial budget?
Go for it.
If I might just start that off. At the UN, we have a goal to be carbon neutral by the end of 2020. And we are on target. And it is because we have that. We measure, we evaluate our entire carbon footprint, and whatever we cannot avoid or reduce, we offset. But it is a practice that has evolved over the years. But I agree with you, and in the end, I wish we would look at our carbon data in the same way we look at our P&L statements or our balance sheets. And I think we're getting there. But there are examples from our own experience that show once we bring it up to the forefront, then we can make a difference.
If I can just add to that as well, I mean, spiritually, I'm 100% with you. I think, practically speaking, the reality of the world right now is that the ultimate metric by which corporations, at least, are assessed is by financial performance. And until we can empirically connect financial performance or climate-related performance to financial performance, I think we're going to be it's going to be a hard sell. We are getting there, and I think more and more companies are seeing that connection. you know, on my team, we did a quick analysis recently looking at what companies are disclosing as material financial risks in their 10K filings versus what they are disclosing as material risks or material issues in their sustainability reporting. And there was scarily little overlap between these things. You know, so it's just complete disconnect between what they're saying is important in their sustainability reporting versus what they're telling the SEC is a financial risk to them. We are starting to see more of this become aligned. You know, companies are starting to realize the implications of this. But the reality is, though, is that until we get to the point where, you know, carbon reporting is mandated, in some places it is, but until we get to that universal point, you know, we're going to have to be selling this messaging to CFOs and you know, the public reporting professionals who, you know, live within big megacorps about all this stuff. You know, it's a challenge. I agree with you 100%. By the way, I do offset all of my flights. In fact, in my company, what we do is we calculate our own footprint plus estimate the footprint, the personal footprints of all of our employees, and offset all that every year.
And video conferencing works too, by the way.
No doubt.
So I think we'll take our last question now.
Hi, my name is Svetlana. First of all, I'd like to thank you speakers for driving a meaningful discussion, and also I'd like to thank the audience for asking challenging questions. So I think all of us got some food for thought. So when we get home, we get to discuss topics with people who are close to us. I want to ask you about key successful cases where both profit and non-for-profit organizations applied technologies and data models into their operations, and that could be successful in sustainability. Something that we can check on online, maybe when we go home, get motivation and inspiration, and then tomorrow when we go back to our day-to-day life, we can apply these ideas and start to drive the difference. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I could share an example of a client that we're working with now, which is IKEA. And I'm sure everyone's heard of IKEA and probably visited a store a few times. And at first glance, it seems like it's an organization that's just trying to grow and push a lot of products out in the market on people, right? But in working very closely with them, they have the goals of growth and of profitability, of course, and they're quite significant. We've drawn the line chart. Well, at the same time, reducing their carbon emissions to zero by 2020, like the UN. So they have these models, if you will, that look at the entire life cycle of their business, from raw material extraction and all of the suppliers by which they kind of leverage and buy products from, to production, transport, their stores. They even bring in the carbon emissions that they estimate their customers are spending to actually get to their stores to buy their products. And in fact, then add in the usage of those products back at home, all the way to end of life, whether those products are recycled or brought back to the store for recycling. So they have this view, if you will, that they're responsible for anything that they touch, from, again, raw materials to end of life. And they're doing a significant amount of modeling on kind of the data behind that, while at the same time hoping to grow and raise their profitability at a pretty fast pace. So, and we're about to share more information with regards to how they're doing it and the kind of the models that they run. But I think if you kind of going back to your organization and look at not just kind of one piece or one silo, or even by scope 1 and 2 and 3, which tend to be really quite confusing, quite honestly, but instead kind of what does your company do? What does your organization do? And what pieces of that can you have an impact on? And undoubtedly, there's a way in which data and better tech and a better vision of how that impact could be reduced could have an impact on your overall company. So that's just the example that I would share. And there's more information, obviously, that we're sharing after that application is launched in conjunction with IKEA. But there are some really good studies out there, and there are some good companies doing a lot of great things. And I think we can all take inspiration from that. Anybody?
There is a very good consortium, national consortium called ASHE. It's Association for Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. And I bet any of us, all our schools and colleges are actually signed up to that institution, especially in the United States. They have a tracking and reporting tool that's quite robust, and their next version's actually connecting that to UN SDGs. So that, I believe, is a gold mine. Don't be deterred by the title or labeling higher education. It's actually very transferable and quite inspirational when it's able to break down ideas into action. So I recommend looking at ASHE's website and their tracking tool.
From my side, I think there's a success story or an interesting story that I think is good to look into. I was speaking at a conference recently, and this older gentleman approached me afterwards and said, I want to talk to you, but I don't think we can afford to hire you. And I said, come on, let's talk. And he's, long story short, turns out he was the COO of a 200-person, privately held little baking company in central Massachusetts. So if you buy a frozen chocolate eclair in the northeast of the US at the grocery store, chances are his company made it. And he said, we need your help. We just got asked to file a report with the Carbon Disclosure Project. And I said, oh, really? That's interesting. I think someone from CDP is here. And CDP is doing some really interesting stuff in terms of collecting, compiling data from corporations around their climate impacts. Turns out that his company was asked to do this by a customer who represents 40% of his revenue. And that company is Walmart. And so I think that in terms of interesting stories or things that you can take home is, first of all, CDP is a really interesting organization, although people who receive requests to do CDP reports sometimes freak out and they would not agree with me. But I think CDP is a really good organization, doing some great stuff. But I think that companies and stories out there around how companies are engaging with their value chains to understand what the impacts are. There's a lot of great stories there. And so going back to your companies, don't think just within the fence lines of your facilities. Think up and down the value chain to really understand and to flush out where are my impacts the greatest, and then design good strategies to get after that.
I want to follow up on the kind of thought, okay, what do you do tomorrow morning when you have digested a lot of this information? And one recommendation I have for you, go to our website called uniteideas.un.org. We occasionally run challenges that we throw out that are relevant to the work that the UN is doing and where we get stuck. And one challenge that I wanted to mention briefly is we have a department called Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and they collect global data on economic and social indicators worldwide. And one of the problems they had is they said they didn't really know what to do with regard to electrification in particular countries. How do we really represent that? So we worked with them on a challenge, and the winning solution was developed by a programmer who in her day job works on Wall Street, and in the evening picked that up and worked with this. And what she did is she allowed modeling of different energy sources for developing countries. It gives you the kind of level of electrification for each household that you want to achieve, and the associated cost that it would cost the country to get from where they are today to where they want to be. And it reduced our computing time that we needed to produce this from 5 hours to 5 minutes. And these are these small examples that have an impact. We use this model a lot when we talk to policymakers, simply as an example of the kind of ideas that the citizen scientists really can produce and that we can use to make our point in the various areas that we work.
That's a good story.
So with that, I think we'll wrap up here. That was a great question, actually, to kind of finish on. I want to thank, obviously, the participants in the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to seeing solutions as you go back to the day jobs tomorrow. And thank you, of course, to the panelists for a great conversation and a lot of inspiring ideas that we shared tonight. Thank you to Churchill Club. And, of course, the museum and the event coordinators for the evening. And I guess I'll hand it over to Karen.
Well, thank you so much for all you contributed to this conversation, for sharing your points of view so candidly with us. I hope that all of us are inspired. We all need to be part of the solution. As a small token of our appreciation for you being with us this evening, we will be very happy to present you with the Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
Wow.
A recording of this program will be available on our YouTube channel shortly, where you will find recordings of most of our other programs as well. We hope you will find that to be a very useful resource. And if you appreciated the discussion, please share the links with others so that we can inspire others, hopefully, to higher aims and actions themselves. Our next program will be on December 5th. And it's another energy-related program. It's about getting to 100% clean energy by 2045. We have the director of the Precourt Energy Institute, Sally Benson. We have Jane Long from the Environmental Defense Fund. We have Arnie Olson from E3 that's done a lot of modeling and consulting around the development of SB 100, which is the bill that was enacted into law last year in California, which set us on a path. Hope that you will join us for that. And you have been a wonderful audience. Yep. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night. Thank you very much.